Am I on? Wasn't that great? Jimmy, thank you. Andrew, the team. It's funny, I've known Jimmy a long time, but I've never got to just sit while he leads worship. And what I know about Jimmy is that he's a guy after God's heart, and he loves young people, and that's what we especially love about him. And what I love this morning is the representation of a generation that's right on our heels now, that are the leaders that are really going to carry us into the generation that we're in and that we're headed towards. It reminds me, looking at these guys, the guitar player especially over here, and I missed your name Michael, this morning. I showed up in this town, packed my Monte Carlo at 17 years old, I guess. Just turned 17. Graduated from high school in Florida. We're going to pray for the Gators here in a little bit. In the Panhandle of Florida, where I grew up, and I set sail for Nashville because I was a product of Christian music. I'd grown up in it, grew up playing all kinds of music, but I was a Christian and raised in the church, and so Christian music it captivated me at a young age. And oddly enough, much of that music was what was coming out of this church and this corner in the city at the time. And so when I showed up in Nashville, I was a driven, passionate 17-year-old kid with everything I own in my car. And I drove up and down Music Row, and if you don't know already, it's one way each way. And so it's funny to watch people figure that out. But I don't think I'd been in a town big enough to have one-way streets up until that point. So when I got here, I had a dream, I had a passion, and I had an understanding, because I love God, and I had been raised in church, that God really wanted to use my life. Fortunately, I'd had people in my life that mentored me, that encouraged me, pastors that called me out, youth ministers that invested in me and recognized that there was something God had deposited in me that he wanted to use. So I wasn't void of understanding when I showed up here, but I was clueless. I thought I knew a lot. And without getting into a lot of backstory, one of the things that stood out to me is, I would drive up and down the row, and I saw all of these big the big music companies and record companies, some of which artists I had grown up that were heroes of mine were all part of it. And then two, I would go to restaurants and I'd see people. There were sightings, of people that you had grown up knowing about in country music or Christian music or whatever. And the other thing was coming to Belmont Church. It didn't have this building here then. The old chapel was here, and they were kind of starting to build this. But we met in a West End Junior High School over here, and there were a lot of people that came, and it was very stripped down. You had a person on keyboards, and it was usually somebody like Michael Smith or Amy Grant, or one of those names that were icons even at that point in their careers. They were becoming well known, and you had a lot of other people too that were worship leaders, and it really wasn't about a big production, and yet it was very moving because you had a lot of voices. The Church of Christ heritage of this church meant that they knew how to sing. It had long not been a Church of Christ, but they hadn't lost the ability to really sing. So I was really drawn to worship, but I was also drawn to the fact that there were people sitting around that you knew were in the industry and that were the business. And this was one of those churches for years that people would come to knowing that you might have a spotting or a sighting of somebody that you had listened to or loved. And that was, as a kid, I remember that being a stark thing. And over the years as I grew, the short version of my story is, at that age, you do think you know a lot, but you learn a lot. And part of what I learned throughout, through other mentors, and I quickly got on tours as a young kid. People I had idolized. All of a sudden, I found myself on stages with them as a player, and that was a blessing. But it also was an eye opener because I realized they're human, And you find out that this religion you grow up in and Christianity you grow in, it's all being tested now at that age, and you're being fired to really kind of determine, what do you really believe? What is the foundation of your faith? And as a musician, I had a dream and a passion, but what God really made clear to me in the first years of my life here in Nashville was that more than just the music, that I'm called unto the Lord first and foremost. So before worship was a big category, and certainly before it was a genre that we could sell a lot of music around, it was a movement in people's hearts. It was a stirring in people's hearts. And if you read church history, that stirring has been cyclical somewhat. It's come back around, however many years it is, 50 or 100 years, it comes back around. It cycles around that Matt penned it really well when it's that returning to the heart of worship thing. That was a great anthem for our generation that we've got to get back to that. But long before Matt even, there were people saying in history, hey, we've wandered away. we've got to come back to what God has called us to, because his calling hasn't changed. And what I also found out as a young kid is that calling is different than stewardship of talent. And so I wasn't called to be a musician. I wasn't called to be this guitar player, singer, writer, whoever it is that I wanted to be. And as a kid, it was to be signed and be in a band, and we did a lot of those things. But the reality was, much bigger than any of that, was that God deposited gifts in me that are irrevocable. Some of those are talents that I steward, but he also deposited spiritual gifts in me and had a purpose for my life. And that wasn't something that I heard from a lot of pulpits growing up. I heard it from a few people. In our style of church, and I'm not here to pick on anybody's style of church because I love the church. But our style that we grow up in, especially in Western culture, is that you've got one person that stands up here and tells us a lot of what we're supposed to believe. And the hope is that we leave and we really learn what the Word says and what the Bible really teaches about discerning and learning for yourself, because the Holy Spirit, the teacher, does reside in each of us. But as a young Southern Baptist, when I stepped foot in this church, especially being a little more of a charismatic church, that offended me. I had to confront a lot of my inner Southern Baptist and inner redneck and inner country boy culture, because God is bigger than our boxes, right? So we could all tell our story. We have a background and a history, but God's bigger than all of that. And so the reality is that God has never stopped moving. God has never stopped trying to reveal himself and who he is in our lives, so that the gifts that he's deposited in our lives have a real clear meaning. So early on in my life, my little plan to be a Christian rock star ceased to really exist. Not, in my mind it started to change. I no longer wanted to aim for that. And I realized driving up and down Music Row, and some of you that live around here know what I mean, this town has always been full of want to be stars and people searching desperately for somebody. I remember thinking, sitting in that pew at 17, looking up on the stage at Belmont Church, going, if I could only stand up here and sing. There's just no telling who's sitting right out there and could hear what we do. And what a false thought. But I was a kid. But the reality is, even in worship, oftentimes, and in ministry, not just worship, and in our lives, we so seek, and we're first of all, we're attached to our identity and what we do, which is something we struggle with in our culture and our lives anyway. And even more so in the church, if there's an opportunity for platform, there's sometimes confusion about that. There's sometimes a misleading about what that's really supposed to be. How it's supposed to, how we're really supposed to serve. Some of that's because our model is, we've seen it done one way, really. Even contemporary worship services, which we're a couple of decades into now of making that transition from traditional to contemporary, even that is not a radical departure model-wise from what was going on 100 years before in church, if we're honest. The music's a little hipper, sounds a little different, a little more current. It changes. It's changing now. We're in another shift again. Even from the last 10 to 15 years of modern worship, it's shifting again. And we're going to see more stuff coming. That will always be the cycle. But the reality is, God has been at work in each of those generations so that his church would come alive. And so we have to be reminded consistently of what it is that we're called to. And so to encapsulate my journey, and I wish I could say more, but the reality of my life experience is that music's important. Worship that we do in church is important. Our models serve somewhat to get us through doing church the way we do church. At the end of the day, church is far more, and we all probably know and agree, it's far more than coming in out of a building like this every Sunday, right? And worship is far more than singing 3 or 4 songs and a sermon, right? And so we hopefully we know in our theology and our understanding of the Bible that he's called us to relationship. And if you study the Judaic life, it was not just engaging with a priest or a rabbi or a teacher all the time. It was living a lifestyle of worship. They were commanded to do, if you read the Old Testament, there were a lot of things that you read that worship had to do with, lifestyle had to do with, and it was all centered around God developing a people and growing a people that were holy unto himself. That's what he's called us to be. And we probably, knowing how many seminars there are in our country and in our world, there's a seminar a minute. We've been very blessed with that. I look back now and even back to Jimmy and Worship Together and other companies that are out that have grown to real prominent places in worship music. And even before them, the Christian music labels that have promulgated music all over the planet and helped it spread. God's used those people. But even before that, the heart of God was to bring true repentance to his church and revival so that he could touch a lost generation. That's never changed. And so what I've witnessed is, if we're not careful, the whole pursuit of even ministry and worship becomes our target even more than what God's ultimate target is. And one of the things I was reading that Tozer said, and he said a lot of great things, but one of the most profound to me was that worship, he reminded us that worship is, God is a spirit, and God is to be worshiped in spirit and truth. And if we simply do things that we suggest or that we love that don't have relevance, we can convince ourselves that it's even the best way to do things. Our styles, our formulas, we create doctrines out of some of that, and we'll stand on platforms and even teach it. But at the end of the day, what does God say about worship? And what is on my heart and what I'm passionate about to share in these few minutes this morning is that as a people, that we get to the heart of what God's called us to be and called us to do. And if we're not careful, because of all the things we see at events and conferences and movements, even among young people, we become emulators and copiers sometimes more than we are authenticators and originators of what God has instilled within us. I've traveled to almost 40 countries in my life, and I'm not very old. I'm only 20, about in my 20s, so it's a lot of traveling at a young time. But in that time that I've seen the world, one of the things God impressed upon me early on was that when we would travel to countries, first I started seeing that we would do worship before it was called worship, and we called it praise choruses early on. When I grew up, I was the worship leader, but I didn't know what that meant. I just sang praise choruses, or sing-alongs, we called them, even before praise choruses. And so we would go to countries, and I would realize that a lot of their music was all being imported from other places, often in the church. But when I got into the culture a little more, wherever you go, there's always an indigenous people. There's always a heart cry of the people there, and you start to tap. And that's what I've always loved about traveling, is tapping into the actual culture we go to. And I love our country. So I'm not down on our country, but you go to any city in our country, you can see Walgreens, Walmart, Costco, Sam's, and every city can look almost a carbon copy of the other because you have almost the exact same stuff. It's not that way in most places in the world. It's becoming more that way, but it is not that way. And Christianity the same way. You've got a little more different. Even the Southern Baptist Church is going to look vastly different in Eastern Europe than it does here in some ways. And in Africa, it's going to look even more different. And denominations look different. And that's because we are a different people everywhere we go. And what I know to be true is that God wants the indigenous cry of a people, wherever they are, to come from within and be authentic and real, because he is a spirit that is to be worshiped, and he will be worshiped in spirit and truth, or he will reject the worship. And so in Tozer, and he can be a little harsh, but he's great. Some of what he says we need to hear, because he's not trying to tiptoe around to say that if we lose sight that our sin, that our lack of holiness in our life, that our unrighteousness becomes so tolerable, including the kind of things that we do in church at times. If we allow our different doctrines and our formulas and our programs to become things other than what God is called to be spirit and truth worship, that's detestable to God. And he's merciful, he's gracious. Thankfully, he puts up with us all. Isn't that a miracle? Because we are all flawed. But at the end of the day, he's a jealous God, and he's after people. The Bible says a lot in the New Testament about his return. He's coming back, and when it talks about that, he calls us a bride. He's coming back for a pure, holy, spotless, unblemished bride. That's who he's coming to claim. And so he's preparing that work. So the thing I've realized over looking at decades of worship music and the worship music industry and church really radically changing, in a lot of ways it's radically needed to change. But what I've seen now is that, God he doesn't play around. He's merciful. But just because we kind of stumble across things and we're clumsy and we do things a certain way for about 50 years and then we start persecuting the next generation that comes along to do it, just because that's our pattern doesn't mean he's ceased to have a plan. Doesn't mean that he's ceased to care about those who need him in a lost world, because we have a limited time that only he knows and is fixed. And we're to be watching for that time, and in the meantime, we're to be busy about the kingdom and building the kingdom. The reason I say all of that is I am passionate about young people, because what I love is when I see young guys like this is there's a whole life now ahead of them to do what God's called them to do. And what I also recognize is that You either have people like I know Jimmy does and other people here helping them get there, or you have a whole host of people preserving the comfort zone they've learned to live in their denominational life or their Christian life or their culture so much that they become irrelevant in another few years and have to die off with their congregations, or they change. And then we're at that point, I believe, where we've got to wake up a little more and start changing. And if change to us only looks like going out and finding a new hip style of modern worship or a certain number of tools and skills to employ, if that's all we're doing, that's part of it. But if that's all we're doing, we might miss what that change really is. Because what God has called us to do first and foremost is to be a people that hear his heart. And so, I've said this often in classes and seminars, and it might not get me invited to a lot of seminars and conferences, but I do believe this, and I'm not against any of the stuff that we do. I love Bruce, I love Matt, I love these companies, and they're all friends. It's a small planet. We've all worked together a long time. We love each other, and we love what we do. And you know what? Young guys are products of the events we've had for years now that are growing up with new tools that didn't exist years ago for a lot of them. I love that. But I also know that with the amount of conferences and events and things that we've had, that if we're not careful, we've almost developed a doctrine around, correct, politically or congregationally correct worship is what I call it. That everything is geared around what's the correct way, the best way. And I'm not poking fun at this, believe me. I know how to tie songs together and that keys matter and transitions matter. All that's important. At the end of the day, how important is that? Really? And what I see, and I had a conversation here the other day, is we've got, even among, I hear this at conferences, we have a lot of people who know how to lead songs. We don't necessarily have a lot of worship leaders because it's not something you just step up one day to do, because it's not, but it's also not this rocket science. If you look at people God's used, oftentimes it's the dumbest tool in the shed, or it's the most clumsy looking tool in the shed. And it's the least likely tool in the shed. But what I believe is that we've got to be careful not to make our chief goal to facilitate people. And I know that's contrary to what a lot of people teach, that we are here to facilitate people. And I'm not saying we don't do that, because I'm going to end by saying we've got to learn to serve people. That's part of what God's called us to do, and we know that. But greater than facilitating people in worship, we are really ultimately called to aim for the heart of God every time we meet. That's why I've always been puzzled. Even though I grew up, my dad was the minister of music in church. I've always been a little bit of a rebel because and sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. And I've had to grow through that, because God's not called us to be bitter either. And bitter and angry, we don't create a lot of change that way. And I've had to learn that the hard way. I don't want to be a perpetual cynic. But the reality is that we've got to, the church has got to change. And some of the ways that we do things we do, are because we like them. And it's not necessarily because it has the most effective way to do it. And I know that we're in a time and period that if we're not careful now, we will preserve this tradition that we've enjoyed 10 or 15 years of and created this new setting. And we learn to do that every Sunday when we gather, rather than really aim for the heart of the Lord. And I know this is uncomfortable. I'm not suggesting you go back home and say, he said that this week in church we should just do nothing and we sit here and wait for an hour. But I do know that in some cases it might be good that we put down everything we do and that we know how to do so well and say, God, are you really into what we're doing? Are you really into the way we're doing it? Are we first seeking what his aim is, what his heart is? Because his heart is always to engage you, to engage me as we come into his presence, so that we become changed people. He cares about your hurt every time you come into the window. Sometimes, I had this conversation yesterday too, one of the guys up here. It's hard as leaders. Oftentimes we get up here and there's a certain amount of expectation from your leadership, from your church, from whatever model of church that you follow. There's an expectation that you've got to all of a sudden ramp it up. You got to have 120 BPM and 4 on the floor for a certain number of times, and all the stuff that we build worship around. And if we don't, that we're kind of failing. And what I appreciate about some of the leaders we've had here is that there's an understanding that, I can't just come in here every time by rote. And one of the articles I wrote for Worship Musician, it termed it this way: it's just push play. I don't like being that just push play worship. And some of you don't either, I know that. And I honestly know some leaders that's probably what they would prefer. If they could just push tape recorder or a CD player every time at worship, they might be a little happier. But at the same time, there are also people on the platforms leading worship that they're missing it too. So we're imperfect people, not expecting that we're all perfect. But here's my challenge for us this morning. We are called to be a people that reflect God's glory and his image. And as we come and worship, we're called to worship in spirit and truth. And the way I've always boiled it down, the only thing I can go by is a life like David's. If he's a guy after God's own heart, powerful king, powerful leader, but he was the run of a litter in some ways. He was the one that was almost overlooked. So he is an example of worship that God called him out to stand and be present. And then if you look at his life, what the Psalms are full of is a guy, it sounds to me, who was just utterly honest with his God. And did we get anything else? He did a lot of things, but beyond that, he was just as normal, sinful as we are, but he was honest with God. And so as we look at what makes worship pure, what makes it holy unto God, for me, it's always had to start with honesty. And if we're all honest, in the room, when we come in to lead often, we don't feel great. There's no telling what we've thought or done or said, the night before, or hours before, or minutes before you even stand up here. But isn't it amazing that it's not, that God still can use us in spite of that stuff? It doesn't necessarily make the sins and all that stuff all right, but what it proves is that God's mercy is new every morning. His gifts are irrevocable. He's going to use messes because that's what we all are. And we can either dance around that, or we can aim nonetheless to be people that are in his image, people that are holy, people that are righteous. And that happens in the way we treat each other. It happens in the way that you serve your families. It happens in the way, husbands, how you treat your wives, and what you pursue as your deepest passions. And the reason I say a lot of this morning is I think there's a temptation, the greatest temptation, and it's not a new temptation. It was Lucifer's temptation. But there's a temptation for us to make this thing we call worship a lot more than God ever intended it to be, and to draw it away from what the ultimate target of God is. And so my heart is as priests, and do you understand that we are a priesthood? And I don't want to over-spiritualize anything, but those of you who are serving in this place, you are of a priesthood, and you're called to steward the things of the Lord as a temple, and to be people who lead the way in that. And the temptation will always be, whatever form it comes in, it will always be to lure you away from what God has called you to be, and what He's called you to do, and who He's called you to be. I wish I could tell a whole story, but just suffice it to say that we each have an opportunity to accept and steward what God's given us, or relinquish it. And sometimes that relinquishing comes through our issues, our sins, our failures, and our just utter inability to overcome our own stuff enough to do it. I've watched in this town, if we could tell all the stories, sadly, there have been many a marriage lost, many a life lost, many families down the tube. Just story after story of people who were immensely gifted, immensely called, and for whatever reason they could never, it didn't end well in a lot of cases. And it's the sad part of it. Now, God redeems all that. There's also equally stories of redemption, and mine's one of them. In my class later, I'll tell you some of the redemption in my life and what God is capable of doing. But the reality is the temptations will lure you away from that, and the enemy's plan is just to snuff you out enough to move you away from what God's called. It doesn't even have to be drastic if he can just get you off target. Worship can become a target. This platform can become what you aim for so much that you really do start to be swayed from what God's called you to. And this morning, more than anything else, I want to remind us that the platform is not a place that we really should just aim and strive to be anyway. If what I love is when I see people that God elevates to that place, they were the least likely. They weren't striving for it. I turned into, at about 21, I ceased to be the kid who was striving. I was striving to get on every tour, everything I could get. I was just hungry. Let me do whatever I can, and whatever you need me to do, I'll do it. As a player, as a singer, as a writer, I'll do it. It's like American Idol now. You watch it and you realize there's such a hunger that it's like, okay, just give me the chance. I'll do whatever it is, and including shame myself and my family and everybody else, just to get to that spot. And at 21, I ceased to be that kind of driven to, okay, I'm getting a little more that if God really wants me to do certain things, God's able to promote. He's able to create success overnight. He's not void of a way to get songs out there. He's not void of a way to to get me through any door I need to get through. And I began to have more of a posture of, okay, Lord, this is yours to begin with. And it's funny that at that time, God gradually started putting me in a whole other arena than what I had been aiming for. But now I'll look back over a 30-year period of being here and at my journey and go, man, he has such a better plan. And when we surrender to that we can get there. And here's what I know about worship in our lives. Some of you that are here, and let me just see your hands if I can, of those who are in leadership of some way, as a volunteer, as a paid staff. I'm assuming most of you have something to do with worship in your church, or you wouldn't be here, or leadership in your church. So it's most everybody. What I know about that is it's a place that you can feel confused. It's a place that you can feel unappreciated. It's misunderstood, bitter and angry. I know that all those things can apply to every one of us because we've kind of been there. But what I want to encourage us to do as we go back to our churches is not that we go back to with some intent to start a revolution. As you've heard from these great instructors and you've had some of the best here to learn from, let those tools serve you for what they are. They're tools. But my encouragement is you go back and that you learn as leaders to aim for what God is after in worship. And if that's to be silent, if that's to flow with him, if it's to use songs that are familiar, or if it's to sing a new song to the Lord. Isn't it interesting that long before CCLI, and we love them, but isn't it interesting that long before that and Overhead and Acetates and PowerPoint, now it graduated to PowerPoint and all these media programs that we use, people could still worship without all that stuff. Isn't that amazing? And it's we now are somewhat dependent on it. And it's a tool. So there are times I want to feel like shut that thing off and let's sit here a minute and let's hear. We've got to learn to hear. You know how I learned to worship? And I'm not perfect at it, but I had to learn. I couldn't fabricate it, for one. I've never been a good faker. And so how I had to learn to worship was literally to have a lot of stuff stripped away for years. I won't go to the whole story. We had a club 3 miles down the road here that we got this old rundown building in the middle of our city that people were shot at weekly almost. It was one of the biggest drug corners in our city. We renovated this building to create a ministry, basically. And the first thing we did had no windows or anything else. We went into a building. We built a stage. And we were poor as we could be ourselves, as starving artists, but God was moving us to create a place where we could bring worship to him. We didn't even understand it. Even acetates weren't being used a lot, but that's all there was to project lyrics, and we weren't even doing a lot of that. But what we learned to do is to sit before the Lord and just play. And it was our building. Nobody could say, oh, it's too long, it's too short, it's too loud, it's too this, it's too that. We had to learn what it meant to sit before the presence of the Lord and worship. I want to challenge you to do that in your own life, whatever that looks like. You may not have a lot of success if you go home and recommend to your pastor that we do that next week, and that's okay. That's not what I'm saying. But find that place in your life that you learn what it means to sit before the Lord and aim for his heart, to hear what he's speaking through you. Because aside from your musical talents and gifts, there are spiritual gifts in you that are meant to encourage this generation like these guys. And if we don't start looking there now, we're going to miss it. And that's what I don't want us to do as a church. Let's don't make it hard for them. Let's help them step into what they're called to. And so all of us older folks, it's our time to be dads and moms and fathers and brothers to a generation behind us and get beyond our traditions that separate and divide us and be unified. It's a privilege to be a part of this. Bruce and Matt are dear friends. We love what they do. And mainly because their hearts are about resourcing the church in the best way they know how to do it. So thank you for the opportunity to share, guys. I'm going to turn it back over to Bruce.